So good afternoon. Welcome to each of you and all of you to the inaugural event of Collegeville Connections, a new series of online events presented by the Collegeville Institute, located on the campus of St. John's University in Minnesota. Collegeville Connections will highlight the work of Collegeville Institute alums and friends from across the spectrum of Collegeville Institute programs. It provides an opportunity for new guests, and I think we have a lot of new guests today, program alums and friends to stay connected to each other and to the Collegeville Institute. But most importantly, you're going to learn a lot from our remarkable guests. I'm Don Ottenhoff, director of the Collegeville Institute. And before I introduce our guests for today, I'm going to turn to Susan Sink, a staff member at the Collegeville Institute. Susan is running the tech side of things for us today and will tell us what we need to know about logistics. So Susan.
Hi, everyone. Just one thing, which is I want to explain the Q&A function. So at any time that you have questions, at the bottom of your screen, you can click on Q&A and type in your question. You won't be able to see the questions, but I will be able to monitor them, and then Don will ask them of the panelists when we're finished. And enjoy the presentation.
Great, thank you, Susan. So to our guests, most importantly, Diamond Harges is a faculty member of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute at DePaul University in Chicago, an institution at which I once taught, interestingly enough. He is a community organizer, the founder of the Learning Tree, a community development organization in Indianapolis, Indiana. He's board chair of the Grassroots Grant Makers Association, also in Indianapolis. And he's featured in the new documentary, The Antidote, on Kindness in America, which was featured recently on CBS. And I encourage you to check that documentary out. And we'll provide the links online on our website. Diamond speaks around the country and around the world, actually, about asset-based development. And he speaks to both religious and secular groups about this topic. He's also a layperson at Broadway United Methodist Church in Indianapolis, where he has served as a roving listener, probably the only one in the country, a roving listener in the larger community in which Broadway is embedded. Diamond now describes his role on this planet as a social banker. He uses social currencies such as kindness and trust that nurture human relationships to build a more abundant community. Mike Mather Mike is the one who's wearing the shirt that says Maine, just to make sure that we understand who's who. Mike Mather is the pastor of First Methodist Church in Boulder, Colorado. And before taking up that position in Boulder, fairly recently, he was for many years the pastor of Broadway United Methodist Church in Indianapolis, where he and Diamond worked together, and they still work together. He's the author of a very good book, Having Nothing, Possessing Everything, Finding Abundant Communities in Unexpected Places. It's an amazing book. I highly recommend it, and it's being picked up not only by pastors and church groups, but also by civic organizations that want to learn more about strengthening communities by drawing on rich social assets already held by those communities. Mike is also on the faculty of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute at DePaul University and has been over the years associated with the Collegeville Institute in multiple ways. So Diamond and Mike, thanks very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Don, and thanks for this institution. Thanks for the Collegeville Institute inviting us to do this. Diamond and I thought we'd start by introducing each other a little differently than Don introduced us. So 21 years ago, Diamond and I met for the first time. Diamond was working as an artist in South Bend, Indiana, at a drug and alcohol rehab place, and some friends of mine said, "Oh, you need to meet this artist. He's really interesting." And so Diamond came down to the church, which was a couple blocks away that I was serving there, and he and I sat down and talked. And since that time, we haven't stopped talking. So he may be the roving listener, but I'm the roving talker. And we walked through South Bend, we walked through Indianapolis, we walked in all sorts of different places. Diamond is a father, a husband, and an excellent friend, over and over again in varieties of ways. I've My life has been changed and enriched just by our friendship, by the trouble we've gotten into, and by the very good time we've had in the midst of it.
Cool. I'm going to introduce y'all to my friend Mike. It's almost been 20 years. And the first thing, if you ever meet Mike, the first thing you're saying, he's out of his mind. And that's what I thought when I first met him in the instance that he described. But I realized out of his mind and I was out of mine. And Mike has been a really good friend. It's also been great. His sons and his wife are a big part of his life and kind of the rubric around his decision making. And so anyway, and the thing that I miss most about Mike is the walks we used to take. So yeah, that's Mike, and I'm still grieving in some ways a loss of a walking partner, but because of him needing to take this role, I've become more richer in his absence too, because I've got other walking partners.
There you go. Right. It expanded. So actually, Dimon, you mentioned grief in there, and I thought we wanted to start this moment today with talking about grief, because grief is what a lot of our work has started from or come out from. Years ago, before I got to South Bend and before you and I met, one of the things was I had been working at Broadway Church in Indianapolis, and I thought I'd been doing great work, and 9 young men had died in 9 months in the 4-block radius around our church. And it just shook me. Here I was doing the traditional work I thought we in churches were supposed to do, right? Running all the programs that always made sense for us to run. But man, the death of those 9 young men just really hit me. And it was right at the end of that string of 9 funerals in 9 months in 4 blocks that I got moved by the bishop to South Bend, Indiana, which then led to me meeting Diamond. But one of the things is I recognized often in the church that we didn't handle grief well. We might do funeral services, but we also had a great ability to deny grief and the presence of grief around us. The churches I served in Indiana had all had big heydays in the 40s, 30s and 40s and 50s. And then white flight had happened in those communities, and those congregations had a remnant left. And they like to continue to pretend like it was still the 30s, 40s, and 50s, even though it was the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the aughts. So this grief that we were dealing with, we began to talk about in our work. And Diamond and I talked about this very early on, because the first story that Diamond ever told me was about his grandfather and a tree that his grandfather had planted. Do you want to say a word about that, Diamond?
No, not really. I mean, maybe later about it, but go ahead.
Yeah. So what we began to do was began to try and not turn away from the hard stuff that was around us, but begin to think about it and imagine it in a little different way. So I'd oriented everything I'd done, because I was trained in seminary and I grew up in the church and I knew what to do. That was to meet people's needs. But when I was meeting people, I saw that even in the midst of grief, people were actually actively healing one another, finding ways to encourage and bless each other, and support each other and heal each other in these difficult times. And finding that, seeing that going on in those situations and places, made me think, well, this is good stuff. How come I never recognize this good stuff? How come I don't build on the good stuff? And so began to think about building our work around the gifts we saw, even in the very presence of grief, even in the presence of poverty and struggle. And it just wasn't, it wasn't something that was normally thought of or seen or known. But Diamond and I have known many people across the years who've been our teachers in this. And we're going to tell you about some of those in our time together today. But I just wanted to note one of them that Diamond and I had talked about that we wanted to make sure to mention to you is a woman named Shauna Murphy. So Shauna grew up half a block from Broadway Church in Indianapolis. And she and her mother and her parents and her family were great, really supportive and encouraging. But Shauna was 18 years old when I first met her a long time ago. She has continued to show healing work, often out of very difficult times. Those 9 young men that I talked about dying were all people that she knew and were close to. And out of that, she went to college at DePaul University, influenced by her mother and her family and her community. When she came out, she came back to the community and began working. She ended up with a graduate degree, and she ended up running the 21st Century Scholars Program for the state of Indiana. And when she ran that program, she began to turn it around. 21st Century Scholars Program works to support young people who are in poverty, and it pays for them to go to college within the state. But when she took it over, she began to build on the gifts of the people in these families that everybody else thought were only grieving, were only struggling. She went to her staff and she said, we hire people in every county in this state. And whenever a job comes open, I want you to hire the parent of a child in our program. Well, this was brilliant on 2 counts. People hadn't thought of the parents in the program as somebody who could be assets to this, right? And people who are in the program are low income. So if you're low income, what could you use? You could use a job. So Shauna, we wanted to mention Shauna because she's a really important part of this story and the way it's unfolded in both of our lives and experiences, both Diamond's and mine. So Diamond?
So the other important thing about grief is, this idea of utilizing people's gifts and talents sounds very idealistic and very pie in the sky. And it's not, if grief is at the forefront of a practice, because we're asking people to do a paradigm shift without allowing space to lose stuff. So ways that I saw our institution at the church, Mike was brilliant at helping us figure this piece out, is to use our existing structure in worship to grieve. And because one of the things that Mike had left out is that we used to be the largest church in the state of Indiana at Broadway United Methodist. We had 3,000 members in its heyday. 100 and how many? 80 committee slots. How many committee slots, Mike?
Yeah, over 200. Yeah.
I'm like, man, it's a lot of committee slots. And now here we are in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s and 90s with less people. And this idea, we were pretending like things were going on, and the only thing we could do was report about scarcity. And so when we shifted that model, what we started to do is we knew we had to grieve for abundance to set in. What we did was we started with this little thing we did, celebrating ministries ending, continuing, and beginning. And a big part of that was so powerful. One is because people pretended it wasn't voiced to say this thing is gone. and we should celebrate the time that it has, but we need to move forward. And basically we did that, and we did it in, like, I remember the first thing we started to get rid of was this clothing pantry we pretended to have. That just brought clothes. People would bring clothes. It was in the bulletin too, so it was official that it was the walk-in. It was like weekend at Bernie's. And so, but that practice, after saying well done, having everybody stand and acknowledging that and saying well done, good and faithful servants, that I remember the quiet in the breath that people took, and they knew it was dead.
Right. But we didn't kill it, right, Diamond? We were just
but it was already, right? But things just life cycle. But the other part of it was that it moved, it made space for new things to blossom up. It's, and one of those things that created room for us is to do parties and celebrations. And the way that really started to happen is that we started to experiment in the congregation. On the committees we still had that was relevant, we started doing celebrations. I remember it was formerly the Committee on Lay Leadership, and we were supposed to nominate people. We stopped nominating. We had celebrations about what was going on in church. And so
the lives of people,
the people, right, the people in the pews, not programs. And it was magnificent because it started to evolve into saying what celebrations happen in communities, and so we went through several iterations of that. I mean, even up to the point where we started at, where after we buried everything, we started celebrating things, right? Things became birth, and we started celebrating those. And I remember one of the things we started celebrating was this young lady named Maya, who was doing tutoring out of her house. And when I started doing the roving listening, my job was to go seek and look for those things that are building community, economy, and mutual delight. And she was one of those. And I remember telling Mike, you got to call this woman. You need to call her. And he did. And
Diamond, can I say that, yes, you had that job, but you were doing this before you had that job. That was what you just did, was you would walk around and you would come by and see me every day because we were friends. And you would say, oh, Mike, I just met Mr. Henry. He sits on his porch every afternoon and plays chess. And all the young people gather around him. But he's not only teaching them about chess, he's teaching them about life.
Yes.
And, I mean,
but I mean, those celebrations, being able to celebrate that corporately in a body that actually became important. And I remember those iterations, we would bring people and start celebrating those things. The other thing, and I'm getting to a point that's going to be drawn out a little bit, but we started experimenting and prototyping those things outside the walls of the congregation. And I remember the first one we started, we thought we were still evolving, but we were doing this with young people, right, and their families and their homes. And I remember one of the times that there was some young people that was part of our congregation. They were part of the roving listening program, and they were homeless. And they met at a local restaurant. They still wanted to host a party. And the idea that they had these gifts, the things that we learned to invest in with this family, was way better than saying we're going to throw a program for them. And after that, we would invite people from the community, we would invite people from the congregation and outside there. And then they would come back, and meet and say, why don't we have parties like young people? And so this was a practice that evolved. But where it really gets serious at is that once as a lay member, I started to realize that I had more power in this. As I started to become business partners with my neighbors. I mean, basically using the stuff that we was doing at Broadway. Mike would just walk alongside us. He would come for walks with me and my neighbors. And we got a hold of a little money, and we spent almost $80,000 on parties. And here's the thing that ended up happening. We started finding people that threw parties already. And this was a time where I mean, we having police brutality now, but this was this other wave of it, right? This is pre this instance now. And I remember this group of neighbors, we gave them $300. They brought 300 people together, and they did this little thing where they had they did plating, food plating. They found all these cooks in the community, and they put them in their front yard, and people would have these tasting things, and they would donate. And I remember the video, it's on our website, that they talked about how healing the party was in the midst of all this chaos, right? And this idea that they really had power. They replicated that and brought 1,100 people together. And I say that has influenced the city of Indianapolis about engagement, right? So now,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
So man, we've been thinking. So now, when we have parties in our community, in our parish, one of the things we make sure we want policymakers at these parties. We want lobbyists at these parties, because that's where people become their truest self.
Is it
at those celebrations? Yes.
You know, I always think you say that parties are the place that people fall in love with each other.
Yeah, it is. It is a place. And like a specific story, like a practitioner, I gave you Roe and Earl, who are cooks. But Mike mentioned our friend January. And one of the things we started to pay attention to is that people who throw parties are healers. They have this currency that is a healing currency, and you know it because they bring other healers together. Well, January is one of those people. She lives about a few blocks away from me, on the other side of the main street. But we'll go to her house, and she does a few things. She does this thing called the Queen Bee Lit ball, where she celebrates women, right? She started doing that, but then she realized that her and a couple of neighbors start realizing that people struggled with mental illness, and she particularly was targeting Black men. And she threw a gathering when we filmed that gathering, and her and her friends did an 8-course meal, and they left us there. And we looked at each other as all Black men from the age of 17 to like 55, and we looked and we was like, why we haven't been doing this? and it wasn't just people who were struck and beaten up by mental illness. These were people who were on the fringes, but doing something about it. And she had recognized and celebrated. And in fact, I remember a couple of people had told stories about people across the table, right? Very private stuff. You saved my life, right? At a dinner. And the food was magnificent. So so in that instance, we invited our friend from the hospitals to come to one of these vignettes at our house. And that's how we started working with the hospitals to help them think about how does celebration play a big part of this, right? And so that's an example of like internal policies being changed in institutions.
Now, Demon, did those parties happen at the church?
No, they were in people's homes. I remember that party with January. The police commander, the chief, couldn't make it, so he sent the commander in that neighborhood, along with the hospital folks. There was somebody from a pharmacy, and then these group of neighbors. January designed these vignettes. Mike was there, Shauna was there, and designed these vignettes of these groups of people who handle mental illness in ways that's been healthy around relationships. And I remember the police chief came in, and his reaction, even though he grew up in that neighborhood, he did not want to touch the food. He was like really iffy. By the time he was finished with that plate, he went back 4 times and took a plate with him. And to me, that's what this work is about. That's why you do parties, right? Because now he has come back to a community that he grew up in, that he is trained to look at people in a way that is maybe polarizing, right? And now it's brought back to, this is your home, and these people are your neighbors. And when you go to a party, you enjoy the food. You know. So anyway, that influences a lot to me, and that celebration. But I think going back to what Mike talked about, we need to design ways that we grieve communally.
And that was, one of the things that I know you feel like is really important, Diamond, is structure, right? And the structures we have don't, pay attention to the scarcity, but not to the abundance. And one of the things that is abundant is the healing that's available in the midst of grief, right?
I think I even struggle with the word structure because it is so manufacturing, right? I mean, in a sense, yes, but I think we should use motherly language like fabric. It does the same thing, but yet it's more flexible, right? And so I think what we in our time together, I think one of the things that I think come from our learning is that we need to create fabric that isn't about manufacturing, that almost amoeba like structures that are flexible, that really support civic life in this country.
With the human stuff, that's why you like parties, right?
Yeah.
That's why we all like parties.
I mean, and kind of segue into one of the things we kind of talked about. I think we call this thing from parties to policy, and our discovery that these shifts had major implications on not just our personal lives, but the lives of people around us is starting to change. One, just for disclosure, we had to realize that this stuff wasn't going to change in our lifetime.
So what's the language we use about that?
What, 100-year work? It's 100-year work. And when Mike was talking about, I think I first learned this from my granddad. And my grandfather, I think he almost knew what he was doing. I say almost.
Just like
but
we.
This idea, but it was intent. Like the way we got the name The Learning Tree was because of my grandma and granddad would house people. And when my mother was born, they planted this tree. And so this type of structure was imprinted in my mind around stories. So I say that because policy affected them in 1952, that they were stuck in a land, in an ecosystem that is no longer there anymore. And it was a swamp and it had asbestos in it. And it was a city dump across the street, and Memorial Hospital would dump its biohazard. And I knew it because my uncles would pick up the needles. And so the shift that my grandparents really did and our ancestors had showed around policy changes. Parties represent abundance, right? And we should build policies that affect those on a very local level, institutional level, and a very large level.
I want to say a word or two about this before we open up into questions. I know, but one of the things that I know, because you and I have talked about this all the time, is how important friendship is to all this. And these parties you throw or that you are a part of because of the other people who throw parties, is one of the things is to get people together who would not normally otherwise ever be together, right?
Right.
The police chief and the commander there with January.
Well, I think another example, we were trying to reinvent these parties. And an example I would probably have the most effect was our relationship with the Central Indiana Community Foundation, which took about 10 years. Mike and I started meeting them when we created the Roving Listener, challenging him on the use of fiscal capital versus social capital. And we just built a relationship up. And then one time we got really good at it, and we started throwing concerts in our house. And we would invite these change makers and also invite these the head of the Central Indiana Community Foundation and another philanthropist came. And the head of the Central Indiana Community Foundation is very keyed in and tied into policymakers. So in the result of that, we have been in a fiscal and a learning relationship with Central Indiana Community Foundation to shape the way they operate, in the way they influence other people who operate in policy level. So because of that, we created these 9 ambassadors in the neighborhood, and
They were like roving listeners, right?
yeah. And the young lady, Shauna, that we was talking about, I get some kudos because I called her young, but she is very skilled at thinking about fabric that shapes policy inside of institutions. So Mike talked about the story early on, but she's still continuing to do that with us. And the other thing that it has shaped is it brought us into conversations with the governor's office. Right. And so these conversations in the workforce cabinet. So these things are starting to spill in. It's starting to spill in the city of Indianapolis. The deputy mayor is rethinking housing, right, equity, and using residents as people they listen to and lead the project around how land should be distributed and sold and developed. So those come from those parties we threw.
Can I ask Diamond, one of the things I'd like you to tell people about is about you came to me a couple of years ago and told me you all have been keeping track of how much money had flowed into the hands of people in your neighborhood as a result of your being neighbors to each other in this way and thinking about this intentionally in these parties. What was that accounting?
Well, I probably should tell people the setup of it, because one of the things we knew that people wouldn't track it. They would track all problems, but no one was tracking abundance. And so we started to notice, like early on in the Roving Listener, I said, if there are people that, if they're in the food desert, there is in a 4-block radius, 50 gardeners. And in my neighborhood, in a 10-block radius, there's over 100 gardens. Then there is more abundance, there's more fiscal currency than we know, and there's more social currency than we know. And we haven't counted. So we started to count it. And one of the best ways we started is thinking about how this happens through parties. So one of the things we started doing, Amanda, who's doing some work with COVID relief right now, we started to say, what happens after a party, Amanda? When you keep our books, what stories go behind those? And so I remember the first year when I told y'all about the open bite night, that year, I remember there was $200,000 that touched the hands of people in that first year, like in the 10-block radius. Over time, I mean, probably now we're in the double digits millions that we can play part of. I mean, and a current example, I saw a question and answer is during COVID, because we already have relationships with people, right? It's easy. Zoom is an everyday thing. We check in with people on Zoom. We do mental health calls on Zoom. So the same things, it's not the same. It is not the same. But those relationships become easier because you already know people. And in saying that, we have shifted the way community centers are struggling to get COVID money out. You know why? Because they don't have that type of engagement. So we were responsible for since probably for about $20 million of money touched the hands of people in Indianapolis directly, because we designed and helped design processes that put people who are afflicted by those issues around housing and rental assistance and build, that stuff, put them in charge of their own futures by putting money directly in their hands. Not only that, we built the process out that the city is now looking at and asked us to pilot, is that those ambassadors that the community foundation they have enlisted their neighbors as agents. So they're not the ones, because they've been celebrating people, they says, hey, you have the power to help your neighbors. And so they gave them $17,000 a piece to, it's about 10 of them.
Hands of people.
Yeah, to put directly in the hands of neighbors. And that's another way that I think policies and parties kind of play together, right? And it gets the people who are civically involved but not recognized at the driver's seat.
this is the driver's seat thing. I remember, as a pastor, I'd been taught that I was in the driver's seat and I was supposed to be in the driver's seat and that the church was in the driver's seat. And to actually move in the vehicle, to use that metaphor, was and has taken and continues to take a while to think about it. I'd always thought about our work, as what we at the church did. But then somebody came and asked me one day, how do we engage our neighbors? And then I realized, if the question is how do we engage our neighbors, it's clear who's in the driver's seat. I am. We are. And that's not the way it is. If people around us are in the driver's seat, people around us are doing good work in the midst of really hard times. And we believe this both theologically and practically. But Diamond, if we had been doing all the other stuff that we used to do, right, where we wouldn't have had the bandwidth to imagine letting go of the institution, letting go of the control, right? And now more things have happened as a result of that, though it doesn't look like we, the church, are doing anything.
I guess, I see a question about the roving listener. Diamond listed 3 things he was listening for as a roving listener. I would love to hear those things named again. Oh, I think one of the things we listen to, what do people get off the couch and do? A lot of times we ask people, I was in a meeting today, I'm on a committee that's supposed to engage residents, and they want them to come do and just get input. I said, if you're going to ask for people input, you waste your time. They're going to give you opinions. Mike used to say, we got an opinion for everything. And he has an opinion for everything, but he only will do one thing. And I found that to be true. So ask people, what are they passionate enough to get off the couch and do? The other thing is ask people, who supports them, who is in their circle.
Diamond, I think what she was talking to about in that question was when you talked about community, economy, mutual delight.
Those are the outcomes. Community, economy, and mutual delight. Those are the outcomes of doing the practice, right?
Why mutual delight?
That's where joy is. Mutual joy. That's where parties happen.
Do you remember when we first talked to the School of Public Health at IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and they said, we're a church. We don't know how to count anything except how many people show up to church and how much the offering is. Can you help us figure out, as a result of what we're doing, is there more community, more economy, more mutual delight? And they said, how do you measure mutual delight? And we said, we don't know. You're the academics. You figure it out.
Because somebody read the question was somewhere, I think about the question about parties. Let's see, I definitely see the personal touch that how these parties Diamond describes come together. Does this approach work in a broader way? Can there be this kind of party commonly
during, maybe?
Yeah, during, say, an outdoor block party. And if my church wants to also meet and have personal relationships with anyone in our neighborhood, is it really as simple as inviting anyone to hang out? So I think it's the opposite. I love this. I'm a Ivan Illich fan because he turns what invitation and hospitality really means. It is about sharing. And because the nature of our country, we think about power in a different way, that sharing isn't really sharing. And so I think the question isn't about inviting people. It is figuring out how to get invited to the parties that already exist. And that's where the magic is. Like, that's why all those parties happen. We didn't really throw all the parties. We hosted and paid them for them and supported them. But we found the people who threw parties well.
That's right. Well, I remember, and not only that, but in terms of a policy thing, you've got philanthropy to begin to thinking that maybe the way they need to do its work is by supporting people who are doing parties and then listening to what people say there.
Me, Shauna, and Mike, and my friend Wildstyle went to see a city council president, And it was great because it was a good conversation. And we said, I think the problem with us counselors, city councilors, is y'all need more parties. And he asked us, how come I don't get invited? And I was like, you're always invited. I said, but throw your own, right? And we'll figure out parties you can get invited to. And that's how policies get changed. And in fact, even though we aren't part of those parties, I remember going to a game with a friend. It was my first time on the floor of a Pacers game. And I got invited to the back room. And the policy was being made over beer. It was, city officials and state government sitting there at a basketball game. And so I'm confirmed that parties happen, but they're not always integrated. I was thinking that.
Diamond, one of the people wrote, it was Holly. She wrote she loved being part of those dinners.
Yeah. Oh, yes. We got people that's on. The other thing is, I was just thinking, in the digital world, one of the things I really love to watch, and there are some creative things out there that we can glean from, and good practitioners. But Tiny Desk, to me, one is a great thing, and I realized because we replicated some of that movement, and so we have like this concert you can see. It'll give you a snapshot. It's just a regular party at your house. The other is I got a friend named Dave Hasbury who's doing this thing called Just Us Cafe. And he comes out of the disability movement, but he's been thinking beyond and how to affect policies through stories. And so he's doing this blog and a blog / art exhibit. And he's featuring one of my neighbors on this art exhibit who had an exhibit of hip hop people in the hip hop community in Indianapolis at the airport. And so he's gonna feature people in South Africa. And he's going to feature all these people, and you can go digitally and see these things. He's gonna have concerts, right, that you can get to. So there's a lot of ways, I think. What ways? I think I saw Daryl answer on here, and Daryl in Kansas City. If you want to know how to throw parties, just take journeys to even some of the people that's on this call. Like Daryl throws good gatherings in Kansas City, and they lead to the Department of Health. Excuse me, my dogs, y'all. Y'all get an extra show. But yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah. Oh, do you mind? You said you'd pause there.
Pause there, yeah.
I just wanted to say, when you were thinking about, I know you said you don't like structure, but I've heard you talk about structure a lot. And one of the things is, it's not hard to do the new thing, right? Like throw parties or whatever. What's hard is to not do the old thing anymore, so that there's room to do it. And that's why structure is important, right?
That's why it has to be. I think there are things in our structure, and y'all hear my dog. I got a giant dog. I don't know if y'all hear him lapping in the background. I think we were listening to John McKnight and Edgar Kahn, Mike and I, talk about structure, and they had this interesting conversation, and they called it blobs versus squares. And it made me think, me and Mike talking about what needs to be in the structure that supports human development, right? And one of those things was grief. And grief and celebration roll in the same way. You need social currency, right? You need to figure out what currencies bring people together, what currencies that actually, like in my neighborhood, that every other household, even though the median income is like $23,000 per like 4 people, there are people that are philanthropists that make that much, right? And so part of that in that structure is having the flexibility to ask the right questions. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I want to say, I want to connect that you're talking about asking this right question with the celebrations thing is, several years ago, your neighbors found a bunch of doors abandoned in the alleys and took the doors and had people paint the stories, paint their own stories, your neighbors who lived around you, right, on those doors. And then you did an exhibition of them. And at the end of the exhibition, at the end of the month-long exhibition, where you'd been taking donations, this group of low-income neighbors gave grants, unsolicited grants to their neighbors, right, at a big celebration. And it surprised the neighbors who got the grants. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was confused with was when, I wasn't officially the roving listener anymore for the church. I realized that this was just part of who I was. And I was like, how do you continue this? And one of the things another thing you need agency. So for me, agency was people at Broadway. And now we venturing off on our own as a group of people. We didn't have that. And so what was our own agency? And so we started to do that. And part of our thing that we realized is that who we are with the group of people we hang out with, about 10 of us are people who are philanthropic in nature. And so part of our sense of agency was to support the things we see going on. It was basically we were the Broadway in some way. We had became the institution, and so you need a good institution. And in that, it needs to be financed. And so we started to be the people to do that. And the way we did it is that because the way we started thinking about structure, we didn't do RFPs. And so we took this money and we would go, because we had a practice already built in about listening to people, we would hand out a grant. And the way you receive this grant is that we found you, right? We heard about you, that you had to fail at least 3 times.
Why is that important?
Well, because people on the margins are penalized for failure, right? The other thing was that you couldn't do what you currently doing alone anymore. So we wanted to get rid of the idea that there's a single individual, a single hero. And then the other thing we didn't do, we didn't support anything obscene or illegal, though we stretched on the illegal end a little bit because slavery was once legal. And so that's where policy change comes in. And these acts, right? A bike shop appeared. We supported a vegan food chef. And we didn't only hand money out. We did back end support. So we used our bookkeeper to keep books and help them set up books.
And we say you don't mean the church, right?
No, I mean our group of neighbors. This group of neighbors we call Learning Tree. And so those things had evolved. And so that's how we were able to count how much money. I mean, really, it's in the millions of dollars, right? There's interesting projects popped up, not because we created them, only because what me and Mike had been discovering is how we shine the light, just shine the flashlight on it. And then when you do it, throw a party for it. And then when you throw a party for it, you invite the people who need to be there that can be influenced by that party.
Somebody else asked a question related to the COVID-19. Did you want to say anything more related?
Read it for me, Mike.
It said, what major effect has COVID-19 had on your work? Maybe you'd already answered that, but I just wanted a chance to.
Well, I think what it because we have been operating in this sense of abundance, right? Most people and institutions around our place have been operating in scarcity. And so it's one, we fit right into the work. It's not like a step, but it also made grieving more important. So we noticed that police runs, right, would come more on our street because people need each other. And so I think what it has been doing is in a positive way, have helped us think about our mental wellness, right, and how we might set up fabric and structure that support after this pandemic is over. The other, it has revealed a lot. It has revealed why our old policies don't work.
Okay, right. You know, one of the things I want to say, I wonder what you'd say about this, Diamond, is that you know, one of the things you've been paying attention to is what people have. So again, in this place where people are thought of as not having anything, including money, one of the things you discovered was that people were giving and lending each other money all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And neighbors helping one another meet a bill or do something like that, because you're paying attention to how people are caring for each other. Didn't that make during this COVID time a time when you could more, you know,
Oh man,
you knew the way people were supporting each other already?
So we have these community ambassadors, and one of the things we talk to them about is how are they walking alongside people in their community? And one of the young ladies that Wild Style in our neighborhood, he started doing this, walking alongside with a few neighbors, and they've been helping them pay people's rent. And I'm telling you, this lady had 50 people in her Rolodex. She grew up in this neighborhood. And so like that was way more efficient. And so we're taking that data back. And the thing about this, the other thing is that what's important about creating a good institution is how you learn, right? And so one of the things we would institute, Mike has been a really influential about my life in this, because I never graduated high school, but I'm always in the mode of learning. So he would conduct these learning journeys. So learning journeys is a thing. The other thing was
You want to say anything about what a learning journey is?
Oh yeah, it's a thing where we would go and visit, you know, very innovative things and ask not to copy it, but to imagine.
Did you go visit churches?
No churches. We only economists, MacArthur Genius, very interesting grassroots groups, policymakers. I mean, you name it.
Who would go on these learning journeys?
Like single moms, professors, church members, pastors, artists, dads, and they would go learn together, and we'll just have a meal afterwards. And I think that's one piece. And the other piece is this idea of data, right? And the old way is figuring out just about the quantifiable stuff. And I think a lot of researchers are getting into this, but the quantitative stuff don't only come through stories, they come through other currencies. And so I call myself a social banker because I think about intangible currencies that's how we can measure that, how much money touched the hands of people. And you can have somebody that can count. So, but data, like we started realizing that the data that people was used was based in the 20s and the 30s, that the questions they would ask around that data. And Mike and I were saying that we went to like a guy at the head of a hospital, and he jokingly asked us like, you know, if I give you some money, what you gonna come up with? And I was like, I don't want any money because you got deliverables. I said, if you gave money, what I can promise is discovery. And Mike, yeah, so you have to have an institution that is willing to base its initial experiment on the paradigm shift into discovery.
But that happens right through friendships, because that person we knew because he was a friend, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And he'd been to dinners, you know, at your house and other people's places in the neighborhood. And yeah, I
think Ted Smith put in. It's important. I think that is theologically the good thing, because we are a church.
He wants to know if we can say more about our friendship, Diamond.
Yeah, well, I was going to think that the thing about being a church, theologically, our structure is based around friendship and neighborliness. It's like the cornerstone of civic life is trying to be good friends with one another. And I think our relationship, Mike, has been super important, because it's not like we be looking at stuff. I remember talking about stuff we used to be bothered by, issues that were plaguing just our society. And you know, 15 years later, I was like, remember we used to talk about that. So that friendship becomes important. The other thing is, while we instilled in our grant, people shouldn't do things alone anymore. Like sometimes the work of abundance is very lonely, because you can only see you're trying to live in a space that is there also, besides all the scarcity. And sometimes it's like you're crazy. And so having a companion and companions, Mike and my friendship, I think, have influenced me to think about my neighbors as my business partners.
Well, and what the friendship with Diamond has done for me is a couple things. One is it's just helped me when I've been down, when I've been struggling with something, and I could call and say, hey, can we go for a walk? And we go for a walk, and I can go off, or he can go off or something when we're talking, and just somebody to listen. And sometimes it's nothing to be said, right? But just to listen and encourage. Sometimes it is to join the dog at the party. I thought your dog was having a party there in the water bowl for a moment.
It was having a party.
It is that at different times we could. There's a movie years ago made about Les Chambon, and they were asking how this village of Les Chambon was able to do some of the things it did during World War II that seemed and it said, well, there was a conspiracy of goodness. I think friendship is a conspiracy of goodness. Mm-hmm. It is when you're kind of breathing together and going. So, yeah.
Hey, I love that comment. That was a beer. I thought it was a politician drinking beer and making politics. Yeah.
Don?
Oh, we're getting close to the end of our time. So I just wanted, one of the things that I'm going to carry away from this is something that Diamond said. People who throw parties are healers. They bring together other healers. That's profound. Mm-hmm. And it's a great kind of underscoring about the importance of these parties. So thanks, Diamond. Thanks, Mike. And thank you all of you online for joining us today. We invite you to join us for future events. Please watch for event information and registration details for upcoming Collegeville Connection events. Next week, January 13th, same time, noon to 1 Central Time, you'll be able to hear from Collegeville Institute resident scholar alumna Vicki Barnett. And Vicki, former director of the programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And she's one of the general editors of the English translation of the collected works of German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Vicki will be speaking about Bonhoeffer and our moral selves in history. That will be one not to be missed. Again, a couple weeks from now, on January 27, Pastor Rachel Twigg Boyce, vicar at St. Benedict's Table in Winnipeg, Manitoba, will be speaking about creative ways in which her congregation has come to awareness about the importance of vocation, both for individuals and their communities. So again, Diamond, Mike, all you listening, thank you very much for your participation. Hope to see you in the flesh at some point in the future. Take care, everyone.